blackberries. And I like contrast, so I think blackberries, deep, sultry. I want something bright and really different, and I think we're going to go with juniper berries. A little bit tannic when you smell them. The berries about so big. A little bit tannic when you smell them. They have almost an evergreen scent to them, and they give a little bit of that flavor, almost a little bit of a sappy flavor to them. And what we're going to do is we're going to take some local cream, and we're actually going to take a handful of 5 juniper berries. I'm going to put it in the cream. We're going to cover it up and let it sit for 3 days. The 3 days is important. We call it cold steeping. Many chocolatiers, and indeed the way I originally learned, will take the cream, they'll heat it, they'll throw in the flavorant, they'll let it infuse for 5 minutes, they'll strain it out, they'll use it, and they'll make their chocolate. And what happens is the flavor evolution of that piece of chocolate will peak in 3 to 4 days, and then the flavor will dissipate of that ingredient. It just goes away. When we cold steep, we give a lot more time. A lot of those aromatics really like to dissolve in fat. And when you give them time cold, you get a much more stable flavor. And I actually learned this reading studies on aromas and actually how perfumes are made. So we're going to infuse that for 3 days. We are obviously not going to stretch this talk out that long. So we're going to move on. That takes care of my juniper flavor and the local cream we're going to use for our emulsion, which will be the center of our ganache, the center of the piece we're going to make. Blackberries. Blackberries have a lot of water in them, as do all fruit. I'm going to take those blackberries, I'm going to put them with a little sugar in a pot. We have an induction cooktop, and we're going to, not too much sugar, but just enough so that I can start heating it slowly and gently and drive the water out. The reason I want to drive the water out is because water, free water in a piece of chocolate invites bacteria. And one of the key aspects of my job as a chocolatier is to know how to minimize what we call the water activity, the free water, in a piece of chocolate. The shelf life of that piece of chocolate is directly related to that. So we're actually going to cook the water out, but I don't want to overcook those blackberries because I'm going to start losing the beautiful, bright flavor of them. So just long enough to get as much of the water out as I can without getting them too hot. And we're going to set that aside. And now we still have a few days before our cream is ready, so we're going to make, I think, if we're going to make a piece that's sort of dark and sultry with a little bit of kind of a bright, edgy juniper note to it, I think I want the shape of that piece and the form to reflect that. And I have a mold. We have a lot of molds. Our molds are polycarbonate, they're about so big. You can see through them. Polycarbonate's important. It releases heat very quickly. Thermal conductivity. And I'm going to use a fairly shallow spiral mold. They're just over 2 centimeters wide, maybe 1.5 centimeters tall. Maybe 18 of them in a mold, 18 hollows in cavities in a mold. And what I'm going to start with, I'm going to take a little bit of real gold dust. And I think I'll just splatter them in. This is a piece I made about a week ago, by the way. I'm just going to splatter a little gold dust into each cavity. That brightness. It gives me brightness. It gives me some sort of luxuriant aspect. And now I'm going to heat a little bit of cocoa butter that we have a little bit of blue tinting in. And we're going to bring it up to, I apologize, I'm going to mix around my temperature systems every once in a while and therefore cause crashes on Mars. But mostly we're going to be in metric. So I'm going to heat it up to about 30 degrees. 30 degrees is where it just melts. It's not too liquid and perfect for airbrushing. I'm going to load it in my airbrush, and we're actually going to, I think just a little with the gold splattered on the top, a little bit of a deep bluish red along the side with a little bit on the top of each of the molds is going to be beautiful. And so we just give just until it looks just nice. By the way, before I do that, I warm my mold to about 27. Too much warmer than that, and it's going to cause the cocoa butter to break down, and I won't be able to remove the pieces from the mold. Too much cooler, and the cocoa butter will be really dull. I want a nice shine to it. So when the temperatures are fairly closely matched, I'll get a really pretty shine on the piece. All right, we're going to wipe those off, set it aside. Now we've passed a few days, and our cream is ready. So you notice some of these pieces we make actually take quite a while to make. I'm going to take that cream, and we're going to strain out the juniper, and we're going to pick a chocolate for this. I have about 20 different kinds of chocolate. They're all beautiful. Some of them are horrifically expensive. Some of them are very rare. We pick very carefully. It's going to depend on the flavors inside, and I think I'm going to go with an Ecuador. It's a little different than this one. It's got a gentle fragrance to it. It's got a little edge. It's a 68%. It's got a little bit of a bite, but not much. And I think it's really going to just give you a little bit of a real brightness inside of that ganache when that piece explodes in your mouth. So typically we'll taste 2 or 3 other chocolates, but I think we're going to go with the Ecuador. I might go with a milk just to see where that goes. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to melt that Ecuador chocolate. I do not use a double boiler because chocolate and water do what when you mix them together? Anybody tried bringing a little water into chocolate to see? Seize, absolutely. When I went and studied in France, I realized that everybody there uses microwaves. It's much better. We melt our chocolate in a microwave. You have to kind of calibrate so you don't burn it. I have chocolates that are $24 a pound. I don't want to burn them. So we heat it in the microwave. Yeah, in our microwave, it takes about 4 minutes to do 2 kilos. I'm going to do 700 grams. So maybe 2 to 3 minutes to melt that up. I'm actually just going to melt it. I don't need to melt it too hard. I just need it liquid. Now I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to take my cream. We're going to bring in a little bit of invert sugar. Invert is very useful, wonderful stuff. Honey is a natural invert. Invert is a flip-handed sugar. Essentially what happens, invert's liquid in its natural form. What's important about invert is it binds with free water. We had that little talk a few moments ago about free water. Once I seal those pieces in, any free water in there becomes food for bacteria. Invert is one of my tools for basically binding up with those water molecules once that piece is on the shelf and keeping them from doing anything. I can use honey, but honey adds flavor. Sometimes I'll just use a natural invert, which is simple to make by adding a little citric acid to melting sugar. Just warming the sugar, half of it will go invert anyway. We just buy it, it's easier. So I'm going to bring a little bit of invert. I'm going to heat the cream to just a bare boil with the invert. Give it a stir. And we're going to pour about 1/3 of the cream over the chocolate. And we're going to start stirring. This particular chocolate has, all cacao has a little bit of natural lecithin. This chocolate has some added because this chocolate actually came from Europe, was made in Europe. Lecithin is important. We're making an emulsion of cream and chocolate, 2 things that don't like to mix. And what we're going to have to do now is make them mix. And lecithin is a natural emulsifier. It'll actually help bring those 2 things together. In the United States, where some amazing chocolate is produced, our custom blends are produced here by chocolate makers you've never heard of, but they're some of the best in the world. They will not add lecithin to their chocolate. Any guesses? Lecithin in America, you can never guarantee whether or not it's been genetically modified. And so most serious artisan chocolate makers in America in the United States, will not add lecithin to their chocolate, which makes it more difficult for me. In Europe, it's illegal to use genetically modified stuff. So they can add, and it makes my chocolate much easier to work with. We do a lot of ganaches with American chocolate, and it is much more difficult, but we do it anyway. This being a chocolate from Valrhona in France, no problem. So I'm going to add about 1/3 of the cream in, and I'm just going to start working. I don't want to build in air bubbles. I use a paddle. We do it by hand. We're just going to start working to build up that emulsion. We're going to start forcing the chocolate and the cream together. I'm going to do it until it starts getting really kind of thick and ugly, and then I'm going to put 1/3 more cream in. We're going to do it again. And it's going to start coming together a little bit, but I can see it looks really sort of stringy and odd in the bowl. If I pick it up, it globs. And we're going to add the last 1/3. And as we keep working it, it's going to take a few minutes. It's slowly going to start to get very shiny and silky. And you can tell if you put it in your mouth, the mouth feels beautiful. It tastes almost like nothing's there but flavor. It just gets lovely. And so we're making our emulsion. Now we're going to let that emulsion cool a little bit. And when it gets down to 3940, I'm going to bring in some butter at room temperature. I want it to be 3940 because any warmer and my butter is going to melt. And I don't want it to melt. And any cooler, my butter is just going to be little pieces of butter. I want it to work into the emulsion. So we're going to work it in. An immersion blender is really nice for this one. Just bzzz, very until all the butter is gone. And then I'll bring in whatever other flavor I want. Now we already have the juniper in the cream. We have the chocolate. We're going to bring in the blackberry. I think I'm not going to strain it. I want a little of the coarseness. Sometimes if I want a real silky piece, we'll strain it. Sometimes you want some texture. It's reflective of what you get in your mouth when you're tasting, and it gives a little bit more complexity. We're going to leave the seeds and all. We're just going to leave it. And now we're going to bring in a little alcohol, because alcohol will bring the flavor out longer in your mouth. It'll extend flavors. If I just use a little bit, you won't taste it too much, but it'll be there. Blackberries, I think we're going to, and juniper, I'll go back and forth between either a Cointreau and a little bit of an orange liqueur or a quinine liqueur I picked up in Pisa in Italy. And I think we're going to go with the Cointreau. I think the orange or the blackberry will be nice. And with the juniper, the quinine might be a little bit much. So we're going to bring in just a little bit of that liqueur and work it in well. I'm going to let it crystallize overnight. The whole thing is going to sit. Next day, I usually eat pretty close to equal parts by weight of chocolate and cream. Then I adjust for texture. So I want this to be pretty silky soft, so I'm actually going to go more cream than chocolate. Set it aside in our cool room, which is kept at kind of like a wine cellar, 55 degrees Fahrenheit or so, and very dry. Next day, I'm going to pull that out, and we're going to pipe it actually, we have to finish making the shells, so we'll do that. So I'm going to take out those shells I made. We're going to temper some chocolate. I've got chocolate. If I just melt my chocolate, and I'm going to do this in our Tango custom blend chocolate, it's one of our house chocolates. It's intensely fruity, and I think it's going to be nice with the blackberries. And I'm going to take this chocolate, and if I just melt it and put it in the molds, I'm going to end up with a mess. Because chocolate is a 6-phase polymorphic crystal, and when you melt it, you get all the crystalline forms broken down, and you just get a disaster. You've seen chocolate that's streaky or has kind of a whitish blush on it, poorly tempered or poorly kept chocolate. What we're going to do, there are many different ways to temper chocolate, which is of those 6 phases, matter of fact, let's stop here a second. See if I can lost my picture here. Okay, we're going to skip it. Of those 6 phases, essentially 2 are stable and 1 is attainable manually. So what's going to happen is we're going to melt this chocolate up very hot to almost burning because I want to break down all the crystalline states. It's all we call a Form 1. We're going to bring it up to 50 C. And it's hot. Any hotter, we're going to start burning the chocolate. I don't want to do that. Most chocolatiers and most books and everyone I've heard says, 42 is okay. It isn't. You're still going to have some residual crystallization, and it's going to affect the quality of your final temper, your final crystallization. Now, once it's at 50, some people use machines, some use other methods. We actually like to work our chocolate on a 7 by 4 foot slab of New Hampshire granite we have in our kitchen. So I'm melting 2 kilos onto the slab. Water near the chocolate, bad idea. I take a big spatula and a long offset spatula, and we start spreading out the chocolate. First, we always stop and look, because hot melted chocolate is magnificent. Each one has its own color, its own viscosity. You take in the fragrance, you get it in your zen-like state. It looks like this just brown mirror. It's magnificent. And then we start to spread the chocolate out to cool it. And really, it's going to take up a fair amount of space. I want to bring it down because what's going to happen is it's starting to cool. It's going into Form 2, which is also not stable, until it hits about 37. And then I'm going to keep cooling it. We're getting to a Form 3 until we get to, and it's going to transfer to a Form 4. And I'm going to keep cooling. It starts to get a little bit sludgy. I'm going to start working it once it starts to cool to maybe 37. I'm going to start working it. I'm going to press it. I want to start forcing crystals to form, the crystals I want. We're getting into a Form 4 crystal, still not stable. I'm going to bring this down to 27, 28. Cool to the touch. It's starting to get a little bit sludgy. And if I go any further, I'm going to over-crystallize this. I won't be able to work with it. You can do this. We use a thermometer, but you can do it by touch if you're good. And we do sometimes. I'm actually going to pick this chocolate up. We do it with my spatula. I pick up my big measuring cup. I pick up my spatula, and we just start picking it up. I always get those last little bit off the edge. Give it some good stirs. I want to stir from the edge because I don't want to bring any of the sort of clumpy chocolate that's cooling around the edge of the measuring cup, and I want to smush it out so everything's smooth. I left a little bit of chocolate in the cup to help warm it up. If I did it just right, we'll be pretty close to about 32. Exactly where I want to be. You can tell. The traditional old style, you take a little bit, you touch the tip of your lips, body temperature. Cocoa butter is the only fat that melts at body temperature. It's beautiful. That's why it's luxurious in your mouth. If not, I'll give it a couple of seconds in the microwave on very low. Bring it up to 32. At this point, because we're going to be filling molds, I need as viscous as I can get this chocolate. So I want it 32. I don't want to over-crystallize it. I have what's now called a Form 5 crystal. Once I hit 27, I start warming it up. 27 is as low as those Form 4s can exist. All the other crystalline states now can't exist. We're bringing it up rewarming it up. We're only forming Form 5 crystals. They're stable. And What's nice is I'll actually take a little bit. We always test. We drizzle it on a little piece of paper. We let it sit for 4 to 6 minutes. If it sets up beautiful and shiny and glossy within that 4 to 6 minutes, it's beautifully crystallized. If I can touch it and it still smears, we do it again. It took me years to learn how to do this without an instructor or a decent book. When I first started about 16 years ago, and no World Wide Web, by the way, it took me years to learn. My apprentice spent about a year getting good. Each chocolate is different. The humidity affects it. Your mood affects it. Everything affects tempering. There are days if you're in a bad mood and you'll temper 3 times. It's very frustrating. We have some chocolates that are very hard to work with. We have some chocolates that are easy to work with. This one is a nice chocolate. It's not too hard to mess with. So we get it up. It's at 32 now. We have a beautiful Form 5 crystal. If I let this sit, it's going to transfer to what we call a Form 6 crystal. Form 6 crystal is stable over time. It's very stable. Over several days to weeks, this chocolate will get beautiful, shiny, and just crisp. That snap you just got. This one's not shiny. It's been beat up a lot, but crisp. That's what I want. I'm going to now take my molds. I'm going to warm them up. 28C. I want them as hot enough so I don't start to break down the crystallization, but no hotter than that. The closer I get those temperatures together, the shinier those pieces are going to be. I can make them look like glass. I'm going to take the chocolate. We actually use a syringe. I've got my warmed molds with a beautiful color in them. I'm going to shoot chocolate in them. We're going to fill them all. We have just a few seconds because the chocolate's already starting to crystallize. And I take my big spatch and I wipe it off, and it goes set aside for about 30 to 40 seconds. It depends on the chocolate. I want to empty these out. I want a thin shell. If a more viscous chocolate, I have to be much faster. A very less viscous chocolate, the shell will be too thin if I empty it out too fast. So I'm going to let this sit maybe 30 seconds. Meanwhile, we'll do the other mold. Same thing. Now I'm going to take this mold. It's been sitting 30 seconds. We're going to flip it over, and we're going to just start tapping it, and we're going to get as much of that chocolate out as we can. Scrape it, take a look. I'd really like to see just a couple of mils of thickness on the shell, enough so it's going to have some integrity, but not so thick that I'm going to have to really bite through it to break through once I have the filling in it. Okay, beautiful shells. Goes in the refrigerator. 5 minutes. I want to get the heat out of that mold as fast as I can. Polycarbonate gives it up pretty fast. Otherwise, once again, I'll get a matte finish. I want a shiny finish. How are these, by the way? Oh, that was wonderful. Cindy Riz is a wonderful artist, and she paints bars and things for us, and she did these pieces hand-painted. Fantastic. All right, scrape. I now have empty shells. They go in our cool room till we're ready for them. I give them an hour. They're still Form 5, but they're cool enough to work with. Now we're going to pipe that cool ganache. I'd ideally like it to be between 24 and 27 degrees. We're going to pipe it into those shells, so I've got about 3 mils. I want the texture of that ganache to just flow, so when it sits in the cool room, it'll firm up, but it flows nicely and just flattens out once I get it in the molds. I want about 3 mils, so I have just when I put the bottom on it, I've got just a thin layer of chocolate. It's easy to bite through. Pipe them in, let them sit a few hours. Depending on what's inside, it might take a day. So the ganache crystallizes some. And now we're going to take some more of that tempered chocolate. I'm going to take one of those molds with my ganache inside, and I'm going to spread it with chocolate. And then I'm going to give it a few taps, and I'm going to scrape it off. And what I want is I just want to see the outlines of those molds in beautiful, shiny chocolate. And we're going to stick them in the cool room and let them sit for a day. Now, we're doing this to make, basically with 2 molds, we're doing this to make 36 chocolates. It's a fair amount of work. We get pretty good at it. Take these, we flip them over on a silpat, let them pop out, come out like glass. Beautiful. You're going to have the brilliant gold on the top, just a haze of red, blue underneath, and it's going to look like it's under a layer of glass, because what's happening is that cocoa butter is coming to the surface when it cools, and it's giving me a layer of just cocoa butter without the other chocolate solids in it. And you get some refraction stuff going on, and it's gorgeous. People ask us what they look like when you unwrap them. That piece, we have to do what you have to do when you make a chocolate. We have to taste one. Ideally, most of these ganaches really take about a day or 2 to settle in for the flavors to melt. So we're going to let it sit. Now we're going to eat one. Look at it. Beautiful. We take a bite. The first thing that happens is the chocolate from the bottom hits my tongue. It's a very fruity, very black cherry, intense chocolate from the San Bruno Valley of Madagascar. You can't mistake it. It's thin. You don't get it long, and the chocolate on the top starts to melt, and I get a thin coating of chocolate in my mouth that's going to soften out everything that's going to happen next. Now that ganache, cream and chocolate, It's a little bit firm, but as soon as it hits the warmth of my mouth, it's going to explode. Boom. It's like chocolate. You're going to taste blackberries. Chocolate and blackberries. That's what you're going to get. Chocolate and blackberries. It's beautiful. And then about a minute later, you're going to taste the juniper. Just on the back end, it's going to start creeping in. So you start getting this juniper. We just did a piece with nectarine and habanero. It took 2 minutes before you got the habanero, and then it got hot. It was great. But you're going to taste the juniper, and it's just going to come in. It's going to be a little disconcerting, and then it's just going to settle in and be beautiful. And then everything's just going to be gone, and you're going to be left with sort of the warm mix of all of it in the back of your throat. And that's what I want. I want a chocolate that changes over 3 or 4 minutes. And it's an experience for people. And that's what we do. We have different forms of chocolate, different types of chocolate. We do all sorts of different styles. But that's the essence. Now we go back to that snap. When I put that piece of chocolate, that bonbon in my mouth, the flavor is going to release in a particular way that's relevant to that snap. If I just take a little melted chocolate and I put it on my tongue, I'll get lots of flavor all at once, and it's going to go away. But if I have a really strongly crystallized piece of chocolate, the heat from my mouth and the chewing have to break the bonds before the flavor releases. I have a much longer release of flavor, and I get much more complexity in the chocolate itself. So if that chocolate you just ate, if that were melted before you ate it, it would have nowhere near the same level of interest and complexity that it does because it is well crystallized and has snap. So we put the chocolate out. The last thing that chocolate needs is a name. And we do art. Names are the hardest part of the entire process. That particular piece, when we put it out, was named a name that my wife told me I should never tell anybody, but we do anyway. We just don't explain it. It's entitled Blackberries Are a Strange Fruit. And I'll leave that to the audience. If anybody knows what that means, it's up to them, but I'm not explaining. And they sold very quickly. But they were lovely. And that's how we create something. Every piece of chocolate we make goes through a process similar to that. And we love what we do. The science is there. And the magic is there. And at some level, there's really no difference. Which makes me think of a quote from Willy Wonka, of course, which goes something like, "We are the music makers and we are the dreamers of dreams. We do things and we make things. And we give people some sort of communication and beauty, whether we're in a lab or whether we're doing something like making chocolate. What we communicate and what we leave the world is what's there." And that's what I have to say, and we'll take any questions. Yes?
You mentioned you use chocolate from the Samburano in Madagascar. What brand of chocolate are you using?
Ooh, that's good stuff. I'm guessing you spent some time over at the chocolate shop down the street.
I worked at a chocolate shop.
Okay. D'Amori's nice. That's an Italian chocolate. The Samburano Valley beans are actually custom blended for me by a gentleman who I think he's won awards for his work with Samburano Valley cacao. It's one of the most intense fruity cacaos. It probably is the most intense fruity cacao. And he does the best work I've ever encountered with it. And I love D'Amori stuff. His name is Alan McClure of Patrick Chocolate, and he's oddly enough in Missouri. But he does 3 custom blend chocolates for me. The first is our Tango chocolate, which is primarily a pure Samburano. It's intense. The second is what we call our Kenshi chocolate. It's very unusual. Show of hands, how many people here prefer dark chocolate to any other kind? Most of them. Milk chocolate. White chocolate. Okay, the milk chocolate's an interesting one. The darkest chocolate I have in my shop is milk chocolate. It's one of our custom blends called Kenshi. It's actually a 70% dark milk. It's darker than an 80% pure chocolate. Because if I give you guys are all going to get this. If I give you a 70% dark chocolate, 70% cacao content, and a 70% milk chocolate, which one's sweeter? Show of hands, dark. Show of hands, milk. Oh, I expected better than this. That dark chocolate is dark chocolate and sugar, 30% sugar. That milk chocolate is 70% cacao, 10% milk, 20% sugar. The dark chocolate is sweeter. We're used to milk chocolates being sweet because we're used to milk chocolates being sweet. There is no reason for it. You can add milk to anything. This chocolate is incredibly complex. It's got caramel notes to it. It's intensely dark. It has no bitterness. Chocolate should never be bitter. It's beautiful. The third chocolate he makes for me we call Axiom, and it's a more traditional Madagascar. It's got this sort of that citrus orange lemon notes you get from most Madagascar chocolates. It's just wonderful. Those chocolates he made for me, I had him bring up the cocoa butter content very high so they're very easy to work and very fluid. And the flavors are very lovely. I don't like them too sweet. We also use some other chocolates from other regions. Venezuela, up until recently, has been wonderful. It's where cacao originated, Venezuela, Ecuador. But due to the political situation in Venezuela, we've lost most of it. It's very hard to get good Venezuelan chocolate right now. Hopefully that will change, but I'm not holding my breath. Chocolatiers, so we have to do science, we have to do politics, we have to do everything. Ecuador is doing some beautiful stuff, beautiful chocolate right now. There's a lot that's not very good, but there are some companies. I've got a company, they won the America's competition for the best new chocolate. They deserved it. It's one of the best chocolates I ever tasted. It was a raw organic Ecuador. They made only 2 kilos of working chocolate. They do mostly bars. And they made them for us. And I keep begging them to make more. We used it, and they're not making more at the moment, but I would like it. They've won a lot of awards for their chocolate, and it's fantastic. We have a Guatemalan chocolate, where people first consume this stuff. Guatemala has not exported chocolate in 500 years. It's the best chocolate I've ever tasted by far. I went to school in France with a gentleman named Carlos Eichenberger, who is the only serious Guatemalan chocolate maker. He got his nose into finding 2 plantations with some really high-quality genetics. In Guatemala, they basically do chocolate the way they've always done it. They take the beans, they grind them up with lots of sugar, maybe some chili and cinnamon, they mix it with milk, and they drink it. No one there eats chocolate. I mean, they just don't. No one even thinks about eating chocolate there. So Carlos found 2 plantations with magnificent genetics and produced amazing chocolate from it. He sells to 2 chocolatiers in the world. We were the first. The Smithsonian actually bought from us a few years back because they wanted Guatemalan chocolate for their exhibit on Mesoamerica, and we were the only place you could get it. I get maybe 5 kilos of working chocolate and 10 kilos of bars a year. I don't pay him in money. I send him maple syrup because he loves it. And I sent it to him last week, and I'm expecting next month or 2 I'm going to get a really beat-up box from Guatemala City. I have no idea what will be in it. But I'll tell you, his white chocolate is the most amazing thing you've ever tasted. And it's real white chocolate, which is that question will probably come up too. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Is there a use for freeze-drying to get the water out of the fruit?
Some people are doing it, and it is effective. And you can keep a pretty bright flavor. Not my style, because to me, I just love the connection of buying something at the farmer's market or such and turning it into chocolate there and then. To me, that's just, there's something vibrant and magic about that, and I won't give it up. I know Carlos actually has been playing with doing some freeze drying very successfully, and you can keep a very intense, bright flavor in the fruit while reducing the water a lot. Plus, of course, you get a long storage life on the fruit, which is really nice. So yes. Yes, sir.
There's so many steps in the process, and you're producing so many different kinds over such a long time. I'm estimating any given day, you're maybe handling 30 or 40 different individual creations, aren't you?
No, maybe 3. As I mentioned, we have 3 or 4 different types of bonbons on our shelf on every given day. So the obvious question, if you think about the economics, is we're pretty darn expensive. That bonbon we made is probably $4, and it's probably this big. And we can't keep stuff on the shelves, by the way. We ship all over the world. We have stuff shipped to France, and we've shipped to Japan, China, Antarctica, oddly enough. A lot of that is just because the people find us for the chocolate we use, because very few chocolatiers will use these outrageous chocolates. They're god-awfully expensive. And I just can't help it because they're beautiful. I mean, we taste chocolate all the time, and most of them we throw away. Sad to say. Every once in a while, we come across a chocolate that blows us away. I just bought some Peruvian. Peru is up and coming. They've been growing cacao since the Incas. But due to the political climate, they've not really ever produced a consistent high-quality chocolate from it. And they're still not. We're starting to see signs of some high-quality chocolate, but the consistency is not there. So my friend Alan got a hold of some really beautiful Peruvian beans and made a very small batch. I mean, we have, I would say, 40 kilos, maybe, which isn't a lot. And it was expensive. But it's beautiful. And he can't make it again because the beans have been so inconsistent. There's just no way he can make it again. So a lot of I've got a Venezuelan who's just continued, chocolatier. You talk to serious chocolate makers and chocolatiers. The Palmyra plantation has been on the list of everyone's favorite for years. It was discontinued 2 years ago due to the political climate in Venezuela. I bought 15 kilos, which was most of what was left in the country. I have 1 now. I'll open it for the right thing. It's delicate. It's 68%. It's dark. It's delicate. It's got these incredible raspberry nuances that flow through it. You can eat it before you go to bed. I mean, it just has no edge to it at all. But it's gone. And to me, it's about this, about taking these chocolates and doing things that make these chocolates beautiful, or even more beautiful than they are if we can. And the whole experience from that, if you're going to start with a chocolate like that, that, by the way, cost me $24 a pound. If you're going to start with a chocolate like that, what you do to it has to bring out the best. I'm taking this magnificent gift, and I'm making it as a gift for other people. It had better be something really, really spectacular. And that's what we try to do. Yes?
So how do you store the chocolate? Since you get your stash somewhere and you don't use it right away, how do you store it?
Cool and dry. Do not put your chocolate in the refrigerator, please. It does not like moisture even more than it does not like heat. I have chocolate shipped every once in a while during the summer if I have to. I don't care if it melts, because we'll just melt it down anyway and retemper it, which is what we do. But if it gets moisture, it's gone. It'll just ruin it. The refrigerator is the worst place for chocolate. Just find the coolest place in your house and put it there. We have our cool room. It's low temperature and it's humidity controlled. And I think I saw one over here.
When you speak of getting 5 kilos of chocolate, what's the form of that? Are they big?
Oh, it varies. Some comes in pieces like you just had. Our custom blend chocolates come in 10-pound slabs that we break up with a mallet and a chisel. Yeah, some of my chocolatiers have some muscles. And we have to do that when there aren't too many people in the shop, because it's pretty loud, obviously. It all varies. Carlos sends me 1 kilo slabs. Those are pretty easy to work with. It really, a lot of these chocolate makers are artisan, they're small. You never have a clue what it is you're going to get or what the form of it's going to be. Actually, those slabs that are about 10 pounds, they used to be 25. I begged Alan to buy a smaller mold for me because breaking down a 25-pound slab of chocolate would take us a half an hour. We'd get chocolate everywhere. I mean, you can't break down with a chisel and not get chips of chocolate flying across the room. And some of this chocolate's pretty expensive, and believe me, we'll eat it off the floor. But we can't use it in anything except for us at that point. We don't want that to happen. So it varies completely. Yes, sir.
The lecithin issue in the U.S., is that soy lecithin the base for that?
Pretty much always.
What's the alternative to that they use in the U.S.?
They use soy lecithin, but they're not allowed to use genetically modified crops there. So it's a non-issue. Oh, in the U.S., there's no alternative that's currently being used.
So what do they use for an emulsify?
They don't. Which means our when I make a ganache out of our custom blend chocolates, I am making ganache with the small amount of natural lecithin that's in that cacao, and it's hard to make. I gave you the simplified version of how we make that emulsion. When we're working with those chocolates, we use a bit of a more complex process. It's still by hand, but it requires a lot more attention to detail, a lot more additions, a slower addition of the fat. And there are, if even a handful of chocolatiers I could tell you in the U.S. who have the patience to do this sort of stuff. It's a bit crazy. And it's hard, and it's a shame, too. There's no reason for it. But I certainly respect the chocolate makers who aren't going to put the GMO stuff in their products into their chocolate. I wouldn't want it. Other questions? Yes?
I have two. First is when you're cold steeping the cream,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of climate are you doing this? Is like a refrigerator or?
Yeah, we keep it sealed in the refrigerator.
Okay.
It's cream. I don't want it to go bad.
And then in terms of tempering, I've heard also, so the process you do is the right way, the proper way.
Well, there are different proper ways, but
What's the kind of, I've also heard of like partially melting the chocolate.
Seeding.
Yeah.
oh, there's seeding and then there's melting. There are really 3 different ways to temper. We do what's called tabling, and it's because it's done on a table, and it is the hardest, but it gives you the most control. I can control exactly how much crystallization I have, as I can see it as I'm working the chocolate. I can control my viscosity. It gives me a lot of control, and I want that. If I'm going to shoot Mondayantes, a little beautiful disc of chocolate, we may put some beautiful things, a little bit of a smoked salt, a bit of a candied yuzu, this phenomenal Japanese lemon. You see these in France everywhere, Mondayantes. Just little bits of chocolate. They're beautifully decorated. They taste phenomenal. I want a fairly thick-seeded chocolate. Otherwise, it's just going to flow out, right? So I'll overseed a little bit for that. Depending on what I'm doing, it gives me control. If you're doing it at home, you do not need to try to temper that way. It's hard to do. You have 2 alternatives. One is to take existing tempered chocolate and melt it very slowly. The old-style way of doing this is to put it in an oven with the light on and leave it overnight. Not all ovens are hot enough, but most do, because most of them use fluorescent light, and leave it overnight. And it'll melt it cool enough so you'll still have a reasonable amount of crystallization. And that's good. That's an easy way to do it for the home cook. You have to make sure you're using real chocolate, by the way. If there's anything other than chocolate, sugar, optionally vanilla and lecithin, milk if it's milk chocolate, stay away from it. You have to use real chocolate. But the other is a technique called seeding. It's basically seeding the chocolate. We melt the chocolate out. We reserve a little bit of finely chopped, already existing crystalline chocolate, tempered chocolate. We throw a bunch in to start cooling it down. We bring it down to that about 34C, where it's going to start to form 4 crystals and form 5 crystals. And we keep adding a little bit of seed at a time and keep stirring it and agitating it and working it. And this takes like a half an hour. And keep working it down. And then when you get down to the 27, 28, slowly rewarm it and bring it back up. And you can get a very good crystallization that way. Not as much control as the other technique. It's when we teach classes in making truffles and things, we teach them to seed. It's far easier to do. Yes?
You keep talking about crystallization. Is this a single substance, some sort of an aggregate?
It's okay, you have 2 things going on. I take a bean, a cacao bean, and it's about this big. It's about half cocoa butter, which is a fat, and a half cocoa solids. We call it cocoa liquor. You would call it cocoa powder. We squeeze out the fat. We have our cocoa butter. Cocoa butter is the crystalline aspect. The rest of it's basically just impurities. So if I take pure cocoa butter, it's very easy to crystallize it and go through that phase diagram. I'm sorry I wasn't able to bring it up. It's very easy to crystallize it, much easier than chocolate because you don't have the impurities in it. It's fairly simple. But that's the basic aspect that we're talking about. Does that answer your question?
Well, is cocoa butter a single substance, or is it a huge conglomerate of stuff?
It's a fairly
chemists, so
yeah.
when we think of things crystallizing, it's a way to purify.
Yeah, it's a fairly complex fat. It's a fully saturated, fairly complex fat. Yes, sir.
What is behind the national branding of chocolates? For example, Belgian chocolate, Swiss chocolate. Is there anything to that national branding?
All right, let's start from here. Where chocolate comes from? I'm going to kind of diverge back to the basics here. About 5,000 years ago, cacao originated in the Amazon basin, sort of Venezuela, Ecuador. There's some evidence fairly recently that it was consumed somewhat there, but mostly it was traded up into Guatemala, the region of Guatemala and southern Mexico. And they made it into a drink, as I described earlier. They also used the beans for money, by the way, and religious items. It was pretty much, the word for tree and the word for cacao tree were pretty much Theobroma cacao now, but pretty much the same thing. It was central to life. The Spanish, in the 1500s, came into, I don't want to say invaded. At that point, they hadn't really yet. But they came into what was then Mesoamerica, and they discovered drinking chocolate. Moctezuma, the emperor, drank this stuff. And it's very well documented in a wonderful book called The Invasion and Conquest of Mexico by Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was a conquistador and a very good writer, as it turns out, and is considered a very balanced view of what happened there. And I recommend it. It's easy to read. It also turns out that my friend Carlos Eichenberger, the Guatemalan chocolate maker, is a direct descendant on his mother's side of Bernal Diaz del Castillo. So that's like wonderful things. But the Spanish discovered it, and they discovered that the stuff was actually pretty good. Their taste was a little sugar added to it, or honey, but they decided they liked it. And they started bringing it back. Now, most people think the Spanish were bringing back galleons of gold from the New World over to Europe. They were bringing some. They were bringing a lot of cacao. The first time there's argument whether it was a Dutch or English pirates captured a Spanish galleon, they found it filled with these bean things. They didn't know what it was, and they just dumped it all overboard. But the Spanish opened up chocolate houses all over Europe. They made a killing. I mean, they monopolized the trade. And they were bringing huge amounts back until at one point the church actually forbade them from using the indigenous native labor as slave labor to harvest cacao, which is interesting politically. So they did what happened back then. They brought in Negro slaves instead. And basically, they destroyed the cacao. They made a mess in all sorts of ways. And really, there is almost nothing grown there now, very little. However, the Dutch stole some, planted in other places. French stole some, planted in other places. Spanish hedged their bets. Some very robust varieties of cacao took hold on the Ivory Coast of Africa. We call them now a Forastero grade. They're about 90% of the total grown crop. Very harsh, edgy, if not processed well, can be very bitter. It's what most people today know as chocolate. It's either grown Ivory Coast or Brazil. Some of the chocolate, the cacao and the Criollo, the original varieties, hybridized in Trinidad. We now call them Trinitario. Some of those are very nice. They're more robust than the original varieties, but they have a nice flavor. Most of the good chocolate we taste today is Trinitario. Maybe 4 or 5% of the crop, a little bit more. The remainder is the original Criollos. They're very rare. About the last 20 years, we've been seeing some resurgence through genetic research and actually finding occasional old strains of the Criollo cacaos. They're magnificent. They're delicate. They have incredible complexity. You can eat the beans, and they're beautiful. There's just no edge to them at all. We get some sometimes. We just lost one of our Guatemalan plantations to disease. It was a Criollo plantation, and it was very sad. Now, that said, the Europeans brought chocolate back. After a while, they started making chocolate for eating, and most of it was made in Europe. So the French, the Swiss, the Belgians, Switzerland was very famous for their chocolate. They produce almost nothing good anymore. The reason is making chocolate is labor intensive, and Switzerland has some of the highest cost of labor in the world. And there may be 1 or 2 really serious Swiss chocolate makers left in the world. Max Felchlin comes to mind. Belgium has gone mostly industrialized. There are some small chocolate makers who are pretty good. There's not a lot that comes out. Callebaut, one of the biggest chocolate companies in the world, is Belgian, but you can get some decent stuff from them, but not the finest by a long shot. The French are doing some beautiful work these days, but the best we're seeing, a lot of it is coming on site now. It's fairly new. Venezuela started it. Cacao El Rey, a company founded by Jorge Redmond in Venezuela, started making chocolate on site near the plantations, and it was beautiful. I went to a talk with him last year, and he was talking a lot about the political climate, what's happening there. We're seeing Ecuador, Madagascar, a lot of them producing on site. Some of the best chocolate in the world now is coming from America, but you've never heard of most of them. So that whole national thing, everybody's out to market. But really good chocolate is hard to find. We spend a lot of our time finding it. I actually always laud Susan over at the chocolate shop down the street. She brings in some really pretty stuff. Francois Pralou does good work, Alan McClure, Demori, of course, the Valronas. You get some really, I think she brings in Bonat. They do some beautiful chocolates. She brings in some really high-quality stuff, and I would certainly recommend patronizing her. Of course, she has ours, too, but other questions? Yes? That's a good question. Hawaii is the only place in the United States that cacao grows, except in my living room, and my tree is very upset that this winter went very long. You may lose him this year, and he's almost 3. But I'll also never pod. But Hawaii has been working on chocolate for quite a few years. I first tasted it maybe 8 years ago, and I thought there was potential, but it wasn't really there yet. And I tasted it again a few years ago, and it was getting better. About a month ago, I tasted some Wailua Estate that's actually put out by Guittard. Most of their chocolate is really consumer grade, but they do some special stuff. And the Wailua is one of them, and it was beautiful this year. Cacao likes to grow in shade of other trees, and so it tends to take on the flavor of what's going around it. In Cuba, you tend to get tobacco notes. This was the first time that the Hawaiian really had some real beautiful notes to it, and you could taste the pineapple in it. We're actually going to bring some of that in just as bars to sell, I think, at the end of the year. It was very pretty. And I have a friend who just bought up an old plantation and is restoring it in Hawaii as well. Yes, ma'am.
A friend recently came back from Guatemala, and she wandered into this little chocolate store in Antigua, and she said she had this chocolate that was like hallucinogen. I mean, not literally. Yeah, she said it was unbelievably good.
There's a reasonably good chance it was made by my friend Carlos at Danta Chocolate.
Unbelievable. It's like this little store out of nowhere.
Yeah.
She came to us all the time to talk about it. Guatemala, this chocolate. It's like, why don't we have this in this country?
Most of the chocolate produced in Guatemala is not good. It's a shame. I mean, even the good plantations, it's not, it hasn't been in the culture or the history for so long that they have plantations producing beautiful cacao, and they just said to grind it up, to quickly ferment it, dry it, grind it up with sugar. They drink it with lots of sugar. It doesn't matter. There are a very, very small number of chocolate makers doing serious work in Guatemala. Yes?
What makes, I feel like seeing bars of like raw cacao, what makes like a bar of chocolate raw?
When you make chocolate, and by the way, I've had exactly one raw chocolate that I thought was any good. That's from Ecuador. And it was beyond any good. That's Picari. Santiago's amazing. But, and also, why I keep diverging on a tree here. And it also took us 3 years to source from them, because when you're working with small manufacturers in places like Latin America and South America, you have to almost be family before they'll sell anything to you. It's not trivial. So, raw. When you make chocolate, you take the beans, you take the shells off. Let's just take a step back. You take the pods, you cut them off the trees. You have to do it very carefully because cacao is unusual. It pods all over the trees. You have lines of pods on the trunks and hanging everywhere. If you damage the flower, the pad where that pods, it will never pod there again. And so cutting them is how you cut the pods is very important. The next thing you do, if you do it right, is you cut those pods open there and then at the tree. You scoop out the white pulpy mass. You put it into a bag or on a tray to ferment. And you leave the pods there because the thing that the midges that pollinate the cacao like best is rotting cacao pods. Use a lot of pesticides, you kill the midges, you get no cacao. By the way, if you use no pesticides, you get disease and you have 60 to 70% losses, which isn't really better either. All right, so we take this pulp stuff with the seeds in it. We either cover it in boxes. At Finca Las Ojillas in Guatemala, they put it in bags that actually breathe. And over about 2 to 3 days, that pulp is going to get hot. It's going to ferment. And the pulp is going to melt off and leave the seeds. If you under-ferment it, you will have no taste. You have to kill the germination. If you over-ferment it, it's going to taste bitter or moldy or just nasty. The higher the quality of cacao, the more particular it is about getting the fermentation just right. When it's fermented, we take those beans out, we lay them out, and I'm describing how we did it in Guatemala. Other places do it differently. We lay them out. They have a big concrete slab. It used to be a coffee plantation, and they have 3 rows. The first row, they'll do maybe like a 15-foot disc of just single layer of beans, and they will dry them for 3 days. Halfway through the day, they have this big rake. They just flip them over. And at the end of the day, they move to the next row. Third day, they dry, then they get picked up. Then they're going to get windowed. That means the shells are going to be taken off. It's paper thin. We take the shells off. It involves using a fan and a few other things. And then it's going to go to somebody like Carlos who's going to make chocolate from it. If he's making regular chocolate, not raw, he's going to put it in what's called a conch. It looks like a big cement mixer. It's rifled on the inside. Some blades go in. He controls the pressure, and he controls the temperature. Carlos tends to like a very low temperature conch because you get a lot more flavor complexity from it. And so he tends to go pretty low. He's going to grind that cacao. It's going to take about 2 days with a little cocoa butter, maybe some vanilla pods. He just chops stuff and toasts and tosses in. If he's going to use milk, he'll throw in some milk powder. Lousy milk in Guatemala, he brings in his from New Zealand and some good sugar. And he's going to let that conch for usually about 2 days. He's aiming for 20 microns. A 20-micron particle size is perfect in your mouth. You get bigger, you can feel it, it's grainy. You get smaller, it starts to taste soapy. It messes around with your taste buds. Grainy has kind of gotten in some places because it's sort of supposed to be like authentic, but it's really not because nobody ate chocolate like that ever. Grainy chocolate was used for making drinking chocolate. They would on the plantations, they would take the chocolate, they'd mash it up on their metate, on their stone slab. They'd make it into balls. It was grainy because you couldn't get any finer than that, and then they'd dissolve it in milk, in water for milk. We actually, in our shop, we do a traditional water-style chocolate made that way. And we have that every day, and people really like it. It's very bright and beautiful. So Carlos is going to make that chocolate. He's going to pour it out, and it's going to be beautiful. Now, a raw chocolate, they're simply going to keep the temperature below a particular temperature. They're going to keep the temperature very low. And I don't remember the specific temperature for raw. It's kind of probably as much political as anything else, really. But Picari does a beautiful raw chocolate. They do a very low temperature conch. they're able to pull it off because their beans are so good, and their processing of the beans is so good. And their raw chocolate is fantastic. Every other raw chocolate I've tasted has been pretty nasty overall. And the same with organic. Organic chocolate is very hard to do. Most plantations can't afford it to do an organic chocolate because cacao, the higher quality breeds are so delicate, you really have to go to a lower quality breed and varietal, and you have to plant a lot more of it and take the losses. And there's a lot of debate about whether that's any better than using a small amount of pesticide. Say again, in the high quality chocolate, use too much, you kill your midges, that's bad. So most of the chocolates we work with, other than the Pocari, are not organic. And I've had very few organics that I would eat again. Other question? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering about your grain. Is that
Say that, excuse me?
is it a fine grain granite? And do you polish it? Or is it polished?
It's polished. I used to use soapstone, which I love, but I used it before I started doing things commercially, and you can't use it commercially because it's porous. And we played with marble, but it's too soft, it scratches. So a polished granite is perfect. It keeps cool, it keeps a good temperature. It's easy to work on. It's a pain to clean. You clean it not by sight because it's got color to it. You clean it by feel. You can feel a little bit. You can feel the smallest amount of cocoa butter or chocolate on there when you're cleaning it. That's how you have to clean it. But yeah.
Do you know where in New Hampshire that comes from?
Couldn't tell you. Other questions? Yes, sir.
How much does the flavor of the cocoa change from year to year in the same location?
It can be a lot. Our Tango chocolate, which is a Zambrano Valley, traditionally that cacao is extremely plummy. I mean, it's not imagination. It's not, some things I think I taste. This, it tastes like when you get to the center of a plum in the middle of summer and it's tart and bright and intense. That's what that cacao tastes like. This year we got our 2012 harvest and our chocolate made from it. It doesn't have that at all. It's this extremely dark cherry raspberry note to it. It's a different chocolate, really. And all of our chocolates, not necessarily always to that extent, but they change dramatically. And that's one of the reasons we just never repeat a recipe. Also because we treat it like a lab, and we all have lab notebooks, and we prefer the idea of learning technique to just repeating something anyway. It's the fun of it.
If
So-
there are no more questions from the big audience, please come down to ask
Absolutely.
any more you might have. I also the beautiful cars, you've seen beautiful pieces of chocolate in the background all the time. Here's some pictures with the address on it. And with that, I would like to thank Richard very much again for coming today. I think it was a fantastic introduction to a science that we have heard much too little before. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you all so very, very much.